tonight, and I'm joined by my faithful host, Josh Bertram, Pastor Josh Bertram, that is. And we're joined today by author, writer, professor Kristin Du Mez. She is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She's written for a whole lot of different organizations, but today we're actually going to be talking to her about Jesus and John Wayne, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation, which is a tremendously awesome read, great book. It basically chronicles the rise of militant masculinity and evangelism. I'm going to get that word right.
Evangelicalism.
But thank you, Kristin, for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So we'll get to your book in a second, but I'm curious to find out like when you grew up, did you always know you wanted to be like a female superhero in the Christian community?
No, I did not. That's the first time I've been characterized as that. I don't know. I think I did always have a little bit of a rebellious streak, though. I think my parents would affirm that. But no, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I certainly didn't see myself as the hero in any story. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. I think I always wanted to just see the world. I wanted to see what was out there. So I did have this adventurous side, and I didn't really have much in the way of aspirations beyond that. Just see what else was going on out there.
Yeah, I mean, but you're a professor, so like
Yeah.
it's how did your life journey landed you in the role that you're currently in today?
Yeah. So I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian subculture, Dutch Reformed kind of ethnic enclave in Sioux Center, Iowa. And, I went to, actually a formative experience for me was, I spent a year in Germany as an exchange student, my senior year in high school. My family had moved to Florida for a couple of years while my dad got his PhD. And, after that, I went off to Germany. And I think it was that experience that really opened my eyes to, or made me curious about my own culture, right? About what the cultural values of Americans, American nationalism in particular. Nationalism isn't quite so popular in Germany, right? And they were kind of putting me on the spot. What is it with you Americans and all your flag waving? And religion was different there. Religion looked different, and so I came back to the United States, I think, with just a lot of questions about my own culture, things that I hadn't been aware of before. I went to college in my small town, Dordt University, within my own tradition. My dad was a theology professor there. And I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I was pre-med and German major and history major, keeping my options open, but still trying to kind of puzzle this, what my own cultural upbringing. And so senior year, I had to make some decisions. I was not dating anyone or engaged to anyone. So what does one do? I decided to go to graduate school and just keep learning. And I studied religious and intellectual history, really trying to, figure out what was the history that really mattered. What's the history that really makes a difference? And it was my first semester there that I was introduced to the study of gender in history. And immediately that week, the first book on gender history that I read, I changed my course of study, added the study of gender, and really haven't looked back. So that really set me on this path. So deeply curious about gender in history and the interaction between gender and faith.
Wow. My earlier comment about being a superhero is somewhat for the benefit of my wife, because you and her actually have a lot of like commonalities and just your life experience. My wife is a small town Indiana girl, raised Mennonite, who lived in Germany for like 3 years, like right after high school, and was a German major.
Yeah.
Speaks German, so I really do think that your work, like the book you wrote, the books you've wrote, have really kind of impressed upon a lot of young women, and just they look at you and they think, hey, like, here's a strong, like, smart, woman that's making an impact in people's lives, and I just want to thank you for that. So
Oh, thank you.
um,
Thank you. And
um,
yeah, I will say, so I didn't, it's a strange journey that has brought me to this point, right? Because I'm a historian. I'm an academic historian. I'm a college professor. That's really what I do. But I have
Right.
tried to write books that answer questions that I have. But it is quite remarkable for me to be in this space, to have the books speak so powerfully into this historical, cultural, and political moment. So I'm still kind of acclimating to that, I think, and
Mhm.
understanding, this new identity where it's the book that's doing this, but I realize it's also, it's me too, and I'm in a new space and getting used to what that looks like. So it makes sense.
yeah. Now your book is called Jesus and John Wayne, and um, I know it's got a really great, like, subtitle. It takes like two breaths to say the whole thing. So, like, it's probably not a popular book for, like, asthmatic people to, like, talk about, like,
It has the
and
handle, Jesus and John Wayne. Yeah.
uh, but I'm curious, like, having read the book, um, I'm there seems to there's plenty of white men, manly white men, like, on the globe that you could have chosen to make your point
Hmm.
in the book. So I'm
Yeah, like
curious on
me.
why, yeah, like Jesus and Josh Bertram,
Missed
Why wasn't it that?
opportunity.
yeah.
So why John Wayne?
Mhm.
Yeah. Part of what I saw is, I first came to this topic more than 15 years ago, and it was actually John Eldridge's Wild at Heart that first opened my eyes to popular conversations around Christian masculinity. And what really surprised me when I came across that book, and it was my students who had first shown it to me at Calvin, that, for all their talk of being Bible believing Christians, evangelicals in their fashioning this Christian manhood were not really drawing on scriptures all that much. Instead, they were looking to Hollywood heroes. To their favorite, or Eldridge's favorite, was Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. He also liked just random cowboys and soldiers and General MacArthur and General Patton and Teddy Roosevelt. Loved Teddy Roosevelt. And so this was striking to me. And as I looked around and saw that there's this vast literature on Christian masculinity, and that pattern repeated itself. And John Wayne was a favorite too. John Wayne. And what was intriguing is, many of these men, not Christians, certainly not evangelicals, not models of moral behavior. And yet it was these kind of heroes who were used then as a blueprint for what they claimed was Christian manhood, Christian masculinity. And that ends up actually, changing Christianity itself is one of the things that I argue. So I couldn't fit Jesus and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart into into the title, but I knew with a name like Kristin Kobes Du Mez that is impossible to pronounce and spell, I needed a really accessible handle. And so Jesus and
Yes.
John Wayne it was. And it actually works really well because it illustrates this, borrowing from secular culture and bringing it into Christian spaces. And it brings us back into the history, right? The role that John Wayne played on screen and off in this kind of Cold War America, and in the rise of the religious right in conservative politics generally. So it worked.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really cool. I never was a big fan of John Wayne, honestly. But William Wallace, I love William Wallace, pretending like you can take our lives, but you're like
Yes.
screaming about freedom and stuff like that. So that's so interesting to me because I never got onto you mentioned the book Wild at Heart, and I never got onto the Wild at Heart train until I didn't read it for years after it came out. But then I
Hmm.
did read it, and every single guy that I read it with, because of course, like it's a guy's book, two guys, and it's like, and every guy has like a maiden that they're trying to save, and every maiden is looking for a knight in shining armor, this chivalry. But I guess I don't know what men thought of before the Middle Ages. Maybe it was just replacing it with something else. But when you're thinking about that, like when I read it to these guys, like they when we read it together, they just loved it. They ate it up, and they,
Yeah.
and I guess one of my questions for you is in your research, and I am into the book. I got it too late to finish it, but I'm reading it and I'm going to finish it. I promise you. Well, I'm listening to it actually, but I love the premise. The premise is extremely interesting to me. And what was it like? What is it about this masculinity that you think? What gave rise to this sense of like Christian men are emasculated, and now we have to, especially white men or whatever the point, like,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to try to get this masculinity back. Like, what did you find? Like, what happened there that you
Yeah.
found in your research that created this vacuum that then got filled with these different ideas and concepts?
Yeah, so I'm a historian, so I'm going to bring you back a few decades, right? And what I realized is, this Cold War era was just really critical. And what we see happening in the late 40s, the early 50s, is evangelicals, already in the early 40s, say, we want to reassert ourselves in terms of influencing American culture. They felt somewhat marginalized after the fundamentalist modernist controversies, and they came together in the National Association of Evangelicals and had a plan. They wanted to reassert their influence through Christian publishing, through Christian magazines, through radio, and they felt that they had a special role to play. And particularly by the end of the 40s, in light of the Cold War, they knew that they had a role to play to protect Christian America, because they perceived themselves to be the most faithful Christians, and they saw that Christian America was under threat. And communists were anti-God, they were anti-family, and they were anti-American. So all the things that evangelicals held dear. And so it was the role of evangelicals to kind of shore things up. And the threat was a military one. And so you needed a strong military defense, and you needed strong men to defend faith, family, and nation. Now, the thing is, at that time, it wasn't that unique. Evangelicals were aligned with many other Americans, especially white middle class Americans. This was Cold War consensus. This was the post-war, baby boom. Traditional family values were in, and all that changed in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you have the civil rights movement, incredibly disruptive, particularly to Southern white evangelicals. You have the feminist movement starting up, right, challenging traditional gender roles. And you have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement challenging American goodness and greatness. And all of these things lead many Americans to question these kind of traditional values. And that's when evangelicals really double down on all of these things, and they understand how they're connected. You need strong men. Gender difference becomes hugely important during this time. Like, femininity and masculinity are opposites. Men and women are different in every cell of their bodies, and it's up to men to be strong, to be ruthless, to be aggressive. And God made them that way, filled with them with testosterone so that they can defend faith, family, and nation. But the feminists are coming after them, and the anti-war activists. And, we can talk race too. And what the solution to kind of all of these kind of intrusions to and disruptions to the status quo is the assertion of white patriarchal authority. And that really moves to the center of conservative evangelical identity. And it is an oppositional identity by the 1970s, right? The sense of, we are the faithful remnant here. Too many other Americans are abandoning these values, and we have this special role to play to protect and defend these core values. And by asserting and defending white patriarchal authority, that's how it's done.
Wow. So there's a lot there, and like the more you talk, the more I'm just absorbing, because it's almost like
Definitely.
I don't know who the lady is that's doing the audiobook, but like I've heard you speak before, and like I had wished that you were the one reading it.
I've heard that from a lot of people. It was not, I would have loved to audition, because authors have to audition. But the way it worked in this case is the rights were sold, and I was out of the loop entirely. Next time I'm going to I'm going to argue for that. I don't know. I have a Midwestern accent. I don't know that I can hack it. But I at least want to give it a shot. Yeah.
No, no. Like it's either like you would be my first pick. My second would probably be like John Boehner, because there would be just something so poetic about like like this, white guy in his sort of like
Reading
voice
it.
with like a.
I hope you could deliver some of these lines. My concern was, I hope that they're picking up on there's a little bit of snark here and there, and that's
Yes.
important that gets conveyed.
Yeah. So in your book, I really was fascinated by sort of the lionization of Oliver North, and
Mhm.
there was a line that you had put in there from I believe it was Falwell, basically saying, you know, this is in regards to Oliver North and everything that he went through, got convicted and whatnot. Falwell says, we serve a savior who was indicted and convicted and crucified.
Yes.
And when I read that, like I underlined it, scored it, like highlighted it, because like truth be told, I bought the actual like Kindle version and
Mhm.
the audio version
Oh,
because sometimes I'm in different places where I can't listen to it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so when I read that, I was just thinking like that's a line that could probably be applied to Trump
Mhm.
today because like a lot of people have sort of deified Trump in a lot of really unhealthy ways, I believe. And I'm curious, just as a person of history,
Mhm.
like is the deification of Trump similar to the Israelites wanting a king or the Jewish people wanting Barabbas versus Jesus? Like I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean that's a theological as much as a historical question, but yeah, it does ultimately. I think this is a book about power. It's a book about the relationship of the Christian faith to more worldly power, and in that sense, I think you can get biblical there. That there's a longstanding tendency for the people of God, if you will, to grasp at worldly power and to try to take care of things for themselves, to not follow the pretty radical way of Christ, as I read the Gospels, which is really turning that on its head. Jesus was not the Messiah that that his followers thought he ought to be, that they were expecting. He was a suffering servant. He divested himself of power and he called on his followers to do the same. And that is hard. It goes against human nature. At least I'm a Calvinist,
Hmm.
so I can say it goes against human nature. So, ultimately, that is what we're looking at here. I think it's a question of power and what is the relationship between Christianity and power.
Yeah, I mean that's I really when I think about the idea of Christianity and power, we have a macrocosm right out in the world of what of the government and the state versus the people and those kinds of concepts. That if I'm bringing it down to the home, if we're thinking about power within the home, it comes to parenting, right? And
Hmm.
parenting with a mother and a father in the classical traditional sense of parenting. I know that there are other forms now, but if we're focusing on that, especially in this evangelical context, um, there's this concept called complementarianism that you bring out, and I'm sure that I can guess about what side that you would probably fall on that. But I wanted to give you a chance to kind of say what is complementarianism, and then what's the opposite side of that?
Hmm.
Like if we're not complementarian, then what are we?
Hmm.
And why is that important in this discussion about power in the church and how we live out our lives as for those who are Christians as Christians here in America?
Yeah. So, complementarianism. I trace the kind of the emergence of complementarianism in the book in the 1980s, 1990s, and we're in full swing still today, and it's the topic of a lot of contemporary debates. And the thing about complementarianism is you can give a very technical definition, or you can talk about what it actually looks like and how people are using the term at a popular level. Even an organization like Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood will have a kind of official definition in terms of, gender difference, very important there. Men and women have different roles, and, they will stress that they are equal before God, but very distinct roles, and the roles of leadership are assigned to men, and, in the family and in church. And then it's kind of open for debate in wider society. But then what you can see is even in the journal of CBMW, and certainly in kind of popular usage, there is a lot that gets layered on top of that. So kind of in the most narrow sense, establishing a certain sense of patriarchal authority. Although even the term patriarchy is contested, some complementarians own that and dang right, this is patriarchal, and let's be clear about that. And then others like, no, that's not. It's not about power. It's about roles. And yes, some roles come with leadership responsibilities, and others don't. All of which is to say, it's historically, right. As a historian, I embrace that complexity, and I think that's important. So what I do in this book is I show how, you can certainly find a long tradition of Christian patriarchy if you're looking for it, and you can find Bible verses that will appear to establish that. You can also find in Christian history and in the Bible sources that and this long tradition of disrupting hierarchical power relations, right? So where I land is actually less significant for understanding this book, although I'm happy to go there. My whole first book is on the history of Christian feminism, but where I where I land in terms of this book, or how I frame this book, is it's really important to know that both are active, right? Both understanding patriarchy and understanding that the core of Christianity is disrupting patriarchy are part of Christian tradition, and both are part of evangelicalism, and both have a long history in terms of American evangelicalism, right? So for me as a historian, understanding that both options are available to quote unquote Bible believing Orthodox conservative Protestants is a starting point. Then that leads me to ask, why in this particular moment? Why in the 1940s? Why in the 1960s and the 1970s? Why did the assertion of patriarchal authority move to the center in the way it did? What went along with that? How was race connected to it? How was it intertwined with Christian nationalism and American militarism? That's really the story that I'm telling. And so how does then so much more get added onto what is actually biblical? Wherever you land, whether you think that the Bible is saying that men should have some distinct leadership roles, women should have some different roles. Why this, modern complementarianism, which actually adds a ton of layers on top of ideals of what does it mean to be a Christian woman? It means to be very submissive and sweet and feminine and sexually alluring. And, you can just add and not work outside of the home, and not, all these things that are not biblically based. What does it mean to be a Christian man? This is where things get really interesting, because one could argue, some have argued, that the best model for Christian masculinity is not John Wayne, not William Wallace, but maybe Jesus Christ. But guess what? Jesus is also the model for Christian womanhood, too. If you think about it, that's all we've got, we women, right? We're following Christ, too. And then we have, the Beatitudes, and we have love your neighbor as yourself. We have Jesus' command to love your enemies. We have the fruit of the Spirit. All of that it's for all of us, right? For men and for women. And so if that's your starting point, then you can start to see where, all of the layers that get added to, gender difference, complementarianism, patriarchy, so much of that is really just cultural constructs, cultural additions that it's packaged and sold as biblical, but it really isn't. And that's really, I think, one of the key arguments of this book.
Wow. So in that same vein, I'm curious on how you think this discussion would be different, broadly speaking, kind of in America, if Hillary Clinton had won, in 2016. Because I know, like, being a person of color when Obama was president, I have a lot of people who are like, yeah, he's just sowing racial divide into this country and so on and so forth. And, you could read like a book I keep promoting that I recommend anybody to read. It's called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. And he talks about sort of like, when the majority feels threatened, basically, people kind of start acting in ways that aren't good. So like with complementarianism, like if there was a woman president, like how would that affect the whole equation?
Yeah. It wouldn't go over very well in evangelical circles, I can say with some confidence. I was actually researching a book on Hillary Clinton and her faith formation back in 2015, 2016. And I had to set that aside to quick write Jesus and John Wayne when I saw, like, wait a minute, I actually have some research here that I think is a little more urgent. So I swapped the order. But no, and what I can say is from my research on Jesus and John Wayne, it's clear that up until these last 4 years, conservative evangelicals have tended to become much more radicalized when there is not a Republican in the White House. So that history would suggest that had Hillary Clinton won, we would have seen pretty remarkable, I think, given the long history of really Hillary hatred in conservative white evangelical circles, that would have been extremely triggering. Particularly on the heels of the Obama administration, where we bring race into the mix, also the sea change on LGBTQ, perceived threats to religious liberty, all of that would have, that's what brought us to Trump. Had Hillary squeaked out a victory, I would imagine that those forces would have been empowered in many ways, and that we would have seen a very rough 4 years for Hillary Clinton, because she would have been facing the same opposition that Barack Obama did, if not even more intense. Now, what's really strange, historically speaking, is how Donald Trump and his presidency kind of changed this equation. Because you can look back for decades and see this pattern, right? During Ronald Reagan's presidency, that was not a great time for the organizations of the religious right. Their donations declined. It was hard to raise money because, hey, one of our guys is in the White House, right? When the Clintons move in, that's when the fundraising was happening again. That's when the organizations are. And then same thing, with George W. Bush, also not a great time. By the end of his 2 terms, the religious right, people were pronouncing the death of the religious right. And then Obama came and whoa, back again, But what Trump did that was so distinct was he was able to both hold that office and grant conservative evangelicals special privileges and power and stoke their fears of marginalization all at the same time. And that was his brilliance. And so I don't know how that changes what happens next, right? Because that pattern was pretty clear. Now Trump kind of messed that pattern, and I'm not sure what territory we're in right now and what to say, what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I saw that. It's so funny that you just mentioned that pattern, because you did kind of feel that way. It's like, it's like when your team. Well, let me put it this way. Like, I remember listening to this lecture that talked about Supreme Court justices and this study that was done of their arguments. When they would write their opinions on the different rulings, and they said that the justices that were in the minority party would always write better, like more like, just more persuasively, just everything, like there's more evidence cited, all these different metrics. And because it just kind of shows you, like, when the side that's losing, if you're losing, you feel like you're losing, you have to work harder. And so if you can get people to feel like they're losing, then that creates this fire within them. And we've seen the evangelical community do that. at several different times. I just finished the book, and we actually interviewed the author of Reaganland. And yeah, it was a tome. It was a huge book,
Yes.
but it was really, really fascinating when talking about this issue of the religious right and how it became electrified, and it got motivated and moved in the wake of during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And I'm thinking, from your perspective and the things that you have researched, what is it about the evangelicals, or even maybe religious people in general? What is it about them that makes it so they can become so organized in America and so good at pushing for legislation or being heard or anything? Like, what is it, do you think, about our current situation or the culture of evangelicalism in America that creates that structure that can then push for change?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's just something to the fact that a common enemy is a unifying force, right? Whether you're evangelical or not, you can set aside your differences if you have this battle to fight, right? So whatever differences we have, it's not as great as the difference we have or this threat that's looming, and so it is just a unifying factor. That said, I will also say that looking at this longer history of conservative evangelicalism, I did have an aha moment at a certain point in this research, because I kind of went into this project assuming that, yes, I knew that militancy was a thing, and I knew that fear was a thing in evangelical circles. And that was very clear in the rhetoric around Trump's election in 2016. And the kind of popular narrative was that, evangelicals were kind of pushed into the arms of Donald Trump because they were so afraid, right? Because of the Obama administration, because of declining demographics, the end of white Christian America, threats to religious liberty, all of this, what choice did they have but to kind of lash out and fight back? What I realized through this research is, in many cases, we really needed to flip the script, that it wasn't fear that led to militancy, but in many cases, the militancy came first. And then powerful leaders actively stoked fear in the hearts of their followers in order to consolidate their own power. And we see that quite clearly in the case of Jerry Falwell Sr. and Thomas Road Baptist Church, right? Francis Fitzgerald, as a journalist decades ago, was kind of embedded and presented that very clearly. We see that even more clearly in the case of Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill Church, that pattern, right, where he uses the rhetoric of warfare. He has, when he preaches, he's flanked by security guards, giving this impression that people are out to kill him, and so because of that, he can demand, and he does demand, absolute loyalty, because this is war, right? Anything short of that is treason. Absolute loyalty on the part of his followers, and extreme sacrifice. That's how this works. And then I saw that most clearly in this this chapter that I write, maybe the strangest chapter in the book, on the fake ex-Muslim terrorists, right? And this is the years after 9/11, when you have these supposed former Muslim terrorists who convert to Christianity, to evangelical Christianity, and then become evangelists, like who travel the evangelical speaking circuit, telling evangelicals about how hateful and dangerous Muslims are, and that they're out to kill them, especially evangelicals and their children. And okay, that's one thing. It turns out all these guys are frauds, right? Their stories are fake. They're not former Muslim terrorists. And what's more is that they're sponsors, right? Organizations like Focus on the Family, the SBC, CBN, continued to promote them even though they knew they were frauds. Right. And that to me was really this aha moment. I was like, wait a minute. Right. So I know that many conservative evangelicals are deeply afraid of radical Islam. I knew at the time, I was watching it happen. I was listening to their voices. And I mean, I had one middle-aged evangelical woman say to me, but don't you know how dangerous they are? And she was reading these books, right? She had the insider knowledge. But what I understood was, right, the fear was real. in the hearts of people like this woman, but it was manufactured. It was manufactured by powerful, in this case, men, mostly men, right? Powerful leaders who are doing so in order to consolidate their own power, to further consolidate their own power. Once I understood that, a lot of pieces fell into place. And so I would say, this whole idea of fear and militancy, we need to take a very careful look at that.
So with your book, it's interesting. Like I was having a conversation with my wife recently, and was saying, how your book is kind of structured, is kind of written, from, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a feminist sort of like viewpoint, and is very critical about sort of like the church's definition of a manly man. He goes to work, woman stays at home, and I was like telling her, I was like, so my wife is actually a stay-at-home mom. She's great. I love her to death. She does an excellent job. But it was almost like I kind of felt like that white guilt I know Josh feels when he watches 12 Years a Slave or something. Like I'm so sorry, Will, like it's okay. I know it's not your fault, and so I remember like just asking my wife, you do feel equipped to work, right? Like I'm not suppressing you, and I'm always like, yeah, of course, just like, your job pays better, like, so I'm curious on, like what does a person do when they read your book, and like how should they respond to the world, in a way that's meaningful, constructive, and hopefully, can bring about change.
So first of all, I'm a fan of stay-at-home wives and stay-at-home husbands, right? So there's nothing in an individual situation. I'm not going to come in and pull your wife aside and say, "Hey, you really need to go get a job," right? I'm actually a big fan of part-time work too, so that both parents can be more involved. So we can talk about different economic models that we could work towards. But anyway, I digress. But the point is, it's when you start saying that this is the God-ordained role, that and interpreting, the scriptures and applying to our own moment in post-industrial America, and trying to say that, this is what this means, that women should not have paid employment outside of the home, when, that just makes, it makes no sense even in, 17th century US categories, let alone, going back to biblical times. So again, historian here, we need to historicize some of this and contextualize some of this. And so when you're saying that, this particular moment, and this particular patriarchal arrangement and free market capitalism is God's command, and the only way to be a faithful Christian is to pattern your lives after that. That's where I'll raise an objection, right? In any individual situation, then you can, it's certainly worth asking, how were your ideals formed? How did you come to make these choices? Absolutely checking in with your wife. Are you cool with this? Good idea. And you might even ask, well, why do you make more money? There are probably some more systemic factors that might come to play. Maybe not. All these questions are just good to keep in mind, to ask ourselves regularly, and to understand that the choices that we make are always constrained by our context, economic context, cultural context, historical context. All of that is great. So it's really just bringing more complexity to our individual situations. And I think that often brings then more humility. We're less likely to tell other people what they ought to be doing if we understand just, how our own decisions are also contextualized. But what should people do with this book? It's kind of funny because as a historian, as a writer, I didn't give a whole lot of thought to that, right? I just really wanted to get the story right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to tell this story. I didn't think that this book, I think very early on when I started this project, I think early on I thought I could change something here, right? Kind of activist. And just months into the research, as I am not changing anything, because I just was overwhelmed with how deeply embedded all of this is, right? And I realized this is not going to change. So I kind of shifted, like I'm going to testify. Right? I'm just going to hold this up. I'm going to tell the story as accurately and powerfully as I can, And there you have it. That's it, right? And what's done with it, I have no idea, but I'm just putting it out there. That's all I can do. And so honestly, I've been surprised. I've been surprised by the response to this book, that it does seem to be I don't know. I don't know if it's creating change, catalyzing a conversation that was very much ready to happen, was happening. But I've been surprised at how powerful the book is in the hands of evangelicals themselves. Right? I've heard from so many who respond to this book in deeply emotional ways. Like, people will describe lying in the fetal position and crying after reading this book. I've had ministry leaders, evangelical leaders, tell me that they have felt almost suicidal, realizing that 30, 35 years of their ministry has been going to this and not where they thought it was going, that they were fully complicit in this, and they only now see. I've just heard so many stories of how brutal it is to read this history, and yet how necessary it is. And so there's just so much emotion running through the messages, the letters that I'm receiving every single day,
Wow.
like multiple letters. And so I've reflected on that. I just wrote a piece in the Times, trying to come to terms with this and realizing that I think this reaction is coming from the fact that evangelicals have remained largely oblivious to their own history and all of its complexities, right? They tell a certain story. It is a whitewashed story. It's one in which they are the heroes. We all do that to a certain degree, but evangelicals have this infrastructure, like this popular culture. They've got their media empires and stuff, so they can inhabit their own stories more fully than many other people do. And I think just seeing this history spelled out with quotes, with footnotes, right? Right in
Yeah.
front of them, they can realize, this is my story. I just didn't realize that it was. And many are not okay with that, right? And so what comes next? I'm just the historian here, but I think that for many, it's I'm asked this question a lot, and one of the first things I say is, I don't even have to tell people, they're already examining their own complicity in pretty remarkable ways, right? It's not just like realizing I didn't know. The very next question is, how didn't I know, right? What and how was I okay? How was I so comfortable in these
Wow.
spaces? And then the next step is really examining, who was excluded from your spaces, what harm was done, how do you make amends, and and where do you go next? And maybe that's leaving white evangelical spaces, maybe that's working inside white evangelical spaces, but it certainly involves listening very closely to people outside of those spaces.
Yeah, I think that's
Wow.
really beautifully said. It's very compelling, to have essentially, it's almost like a mirror held up and, against something that you've grown up with and you've known and feel so familiar. And then to have like all of a sudden, like, you start to see things as more complicated than you thought they were, and how difficult that can be for us. It's like when you find out, like, that that your mom and like your like your grandparents like didn't get along and had drama. You know what I mean? Like when you're a kid, like everything was cool, and then you grow up, you're like, oh no, she said this, and then you're like, oh my gosh, like you guys are human. Like what's going on here? Like, how could you do this to me? It's almost like that sense of shock. And when you talk about Mark Driscoll, that particularly hits me because he, really helped me personally through a time that like I needed it. And I was hit hard when like he had to step down from Mars Hill and everything. And he had this like appeal to dudes, like to men that was like, you just need to go out there, quit being whatever I can't say on air or whatever, and just go and do something with your life. And like at the time I really needed that, I'm like, yeah, you're right. Like, dude, I'm just being lazy. I need to go do something with my life and all this stuff. But, when I'm listening, I didn't listen to him critically. And I guess my question is, when you're coming from the point of view of a historian, and you got to bring the theology into this
Mm-hmm.
for us to have application here, like, what kind of principles do you think that I should use, or maybe should have used when 10 years ago or 15 years ago, to understand, like, hey, here's what, here's the historical realities.
Yeah.
And now, how can I contextualize this to my situation? So here's what Paul wrote in this letter to the Corinthian church, and here's what he wrote to this letter to Timothy. And now, but here, like what kind of principles should we bring in mind to know, like, there is a history there, and just because it's said there doesn't mean it's the same thing as here now.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, how do you bring it from there to here as a historian? Like,
Mm-hmm.
its significance from what Paul said to what we're doing now, to help us become more educated and critical in a good way about the kind of things that we consume, especially things that hit us so deeply,
Mm-hmm.
and hit us at such a key place in our heart. They're so compelling to us.
Mm-hmm.
Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a very rich question. I think that one thing I would say is that we need to have more conversations between theologians and historians here. Right, because theologians are, or just ordinary Bible readers, right, are going to look to take what is the lesson from Paul and then apply it here and now, which of course that's kind of part of discerning faithful Christian living. But then when the historians come in, they can say, interesting question. Here's how people in the first century answered that question. Here's how people in the 13th century answered that question. Here's how, people in, contemporary Uganda are answering that question. Here's how, and it doesn't entirely relativize, right? We're still all seeking biblical truth and seeking to live, but it does give us a humility in terms of thinking, this is the one and only answer, and we've got it. Because history will disrupt that. It will absolutely disrupt that. So bringing historians and theologians into more active conversation is important. I don't see this book as doing much theology. There's a little bit of a theological framing here. In that, like I said, my understanding of the gospel and of the Jesus of the gospels does not align with Mark Driscoll's understanding. And so that gives me a kind of critical framing, but you don't have to believe that Christianity is true to read this book. I mean, it has the stamp of approval of a bunch of atheists and revolutionary communists. And right, I mean, it's a work of history, right? But I am upfront about this. I make my own kind of faith position clear. And you can see that there's a bit of a theological framing of it. Let's take a look at this, and let me just speak to evangelicals on their own terms, just for a moment, right? This Bible believing, faith community, but so bring theologians and historians into conversation. Super important. What I can do is help theologians do their work better. I think, right, that historians can come alongside, complicate things, and now do your theology, understanding these complexities. What I would also say is, again, very important to listen to people who have different experiences than you do. And so what could you have done differently? Maybe I talk in the conclusion to this book about how people have walked away from this ideology. Like what has really, kind of freed them from the grip of people who are all in for Mark Driscoll, who listen to hours on end of John Piper every day, and Driscoll. And for many, it was, encountering somebody from the outside, right? Encountering an egalitarian couple who were so clearly faithful Christians, right? And like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to exist in the world that they were formed in. Complementarianism was the only faithful way to be a Christian. Or men talk about being in these sex segregated Bible studies, right? That like that's what evangelicals do. That's what college guys do. That's what, these spaces, these Wild at Heart retreats, all of that. So much just, men over here, the ladies over here. And what happens when you bring them together? Many will hear, wow, that's some spiritual insight from the ladies, that they, and it's actually sometimes a different sort of insight. So when I read Wild at Heart, I wasn't called to this militant, I wasn't called to this great adventure. I was told I needed to be vulnerable, to be a seductress, essentially, to seduce a man, to share in his adventure. That wasn't really my thing. Right. And so there was no place for me there. So I could have told you like, kind of not cool here. Same thing with Mark Driscoll, right? You could maybe gloss over some of the stuff he was talking about in terms of sex, in terms of women and submission and all of that, because you were latching onto the part that had meaning for you. But there are a lot of women who could say, ooh, I'm not so cool with this. This is kind of problematic here, right? And we're just talking gender here. We can bring race into this conversation as well. And how many white Christians have intentionally or unintentionally created segregated spaces in their churches, in their organizations, in their communities, simply not hearing the voices of those who are different. And so history can do that for you, but you don't have to study history. You can also just talk to people who are having different experiences, who are also seeking to follow Christ, and they will help you. They'll help. We help each other in this, like, actually, no, there's a problem there. And we need to not just act out of our own experience. And I mean, this makes sense biblically if we think in terms of the body of Christ.
So, Kristin, last question, just on the last just few minutes we have here with you. I'm curious. Our audience is very diverse. We have Republicans, Democrats, atheists, believers, Muslims. You name it. That's one of the beauty of just combining religion and politics, and having a conservative Trump voting person, Josh, and sort of a liberal progressive me,
Yes.
have a podcast together. So. I'm curious on what do non-Christians or believers get wrong about people of faith? And second is if you could make an appeal to someone listening that doesn't know Jesus, what would you tell them?
Okay, these are
2 minutes.
These are different questions that I've had before. Okay, so let's see. Question number 1: what do people get wrong? It depends which people. It really does. I guess. Just to remember that every person and every religious believer is complicated, right? And when we talk about them, when we write about them, you have to make some generalizations. You have to talk about kind of movements and traditions and teachings, and you have to work with survey data. And at the same time, when people personally, it's always complicated, right? And they can absolutely be shaped by the ideologies that I describe, but they're also really complicated. And even people who hold views that one might find abhorrent, and this works both ways across this divide. Often they can be quite lovely people as well. And for those of us who move in between these spaces, we know that. For those, which doesn't mean that I should say that the political isn't important, right? It is, and it's not just a kind of ideology. It's not just abstract. It shapes the way people live. It shapes the way they vote, and it shapes the policies that are made that have very, very real effects on people's lives, and have more dire effects on some people's lives than on others. So, I mean, I do politics, right, for a living. I think it's very important, and at the same time, there's a personal dynamic here as well, and we have to somehow hold those together and kind of fight the fight as we see it, and also be in community with people in this democracy who are very different from us, sometimes in our churches who are very different from us, in our workplaces, and often in our own families too. So I guess that's the one thing. That wasn't really one thing, but I'll say it was. And then, wait, you have to rephrase that. You have to give me the second one again.
Yeah. If you can make an appeal to someone listening that doesn't know Jesus, what would you tell them?
You're turning me into an evangelical here. I have to evangelize. Let's see. I would say, so for me as a Christian, I only somewhat shaped by evangelicalism. So I've never been the kind of, handing out tracts kind of need to evangelize. I prefer more to kind of try to live my faith, and my faith is more about what I place my hope in. And in that way, it is not entirely independent of, but largely independent of how people who claim to follow that Christ actually behave. And so, I am. A lot of people ask me, "How are you able to remain a Christian given what you know and what you've written?" And, for me, I've just, in my own tradition, I'm a Calvinist, which has a pretty robust understanding of fallenness and human sin and all of that. So I'm cool with it. I expect no less of all of us, but, my faith does not ultimately depend on the actions of people who claim to believe claim to follow Christ. What I would also say is that, to keep in mind that, I don't know, Christians tend to talk in universal categories, right? And to imagine ourselves as one community. And you confess Christ, you're a Christian. And there are absolutely theological reasons for saying that. As a historian, I am just drawn to the particulars. And so I have to ask, are people who claim to be Christians, are they really participating in the same faith, right? Are they following the same Christ? Because boy, scratch beneath the surface, and there are some really, really huge differences. So I guess that would be another space where I'm kind of thinking, ultimately, just because we use the same words, is this actually is this the same faith that we're talking about? So I would say, allowing for some of those questions to surface as from outside too, trying to understand, what is Christianity? What does it mean to be Christian? I tend to see a lot of particularities, a lot of difference there, and not a whole lot of unity, frankly.
Wow. Well, thank you for that answer. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate having you,
Yes, thank
Kristin Du
you.
Mez. The book is Jesus and John Wayne and Deep Breath: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So make sure you guys go out and buy it. There's also it's going in paperback now too, right? So
It is June 8th, the paperback releases, and we have a new preface, which brings it all the way up through 2020.
Great.
Yeah, so make sure you guys buy the book, buy the audio version, and thank you so much, Kristin.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
This is great.
Yeah, we'll see you guys later. Bye bye.